Dennis Andrew Nilsen was a Scottish serial killer and necrophile who murdered at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983 in London. Convicted at the Old Bailey of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder, Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment on the 4th of November 1983, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. This recommendation was later changed to a whole life tariff in December 1994. In his later years, Nilsen was imprisoned at Full Sutton Maximum Security Prison. Childhood. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, the second of 3 children born to Elizabeth Duthie White and Olav Magnus Moxheim. Moxheim was a Norwegian soldier who had traveled to Scotland in 1940 as part of the Free Norwegian Forces following the German occupation of Norway. After a brief courtship, he married Elizabeth White in May 1942. The newlyweds moved into her parents' house. Nilsen's scholastic record was above average. He displayed a flair for history and art, but shunned sports. He finished his schooling in 1961 and briefly worked in a canning factory as he considered which career path he should choose. After 3 weeks at the factory, Nilsen informed his mother that he intended to join the army, where he intended to train as a chef. Nilsen passed the entrance examinations and received official notification he was to enlist for 9 years' service in September 1961. Commencing his training with the Army Catering Corps at St. Omer Barracks in Aldershot, Hampshire. Within weeks, Nilsen began to excel in his Army duties. He later described his 3 years of training at Aldershot as the happiest of my life. He relished the travel opportunities afforded him in his training and recalled as a highlight his regiment taking part in a ceremonial parade attended by both the Queen and Field Marshal Lord Montgomery of Alamein. So stick to your seats, because now we'll be disclosing the creepiest facts and truths about the most horrendous serial killer. Often known as the British Dahmer, he is Dennis Nilsen, one of the most notorious serial killers in Britain. Why do you think he did so? Keep watching the video to know everything about him and his crimes. Although the stories about Jeffrey Dahmer were told in books in the early 21st century, it was because of the Netflix series on Dahmer he came to light for the whole globe. If you think Dahmer's motives and method of operation were horrible, then you still don't know about another murderous necrophile who was imprisoned less than 10 years before Dahmer. It was Dennis Nilsen, the forerunner of Jeffrey Dahmer. One of the most prolific and horrendous serial killers of the contemporary era, Dennis Nilsen's horrific story of his terrible murdering spree throughout the late 70s was adapted for an award-winning ITV police drama, Des, back in 2020. This Scottish murderer was arrested in 1983 when human remains were found causing a blockage in a drainage near his home in London. Let's first have a look at Dennis Nilsen's life and what led him to become a serial killer. Life of Dennis Nilsen. Nilsen comes from a broken family as his father prioritized the Norwegian forces above his family. Nilsen spent most of his childhood with his grandfather, and it was his sudden death that became the beginning point of his journey to becoming a serial killer. Let's dig in a bit deeper. In his early teenage years, Nilsen got confused about his sexuality as he fondled both his brother and sister. However, he joined Army Cadet Force at age 14 to escape away from his thoughts and feelings. As time went by, he realized more about his feelings for guys but kept them hidden from his colleagues. In an event where he passed out because of excessive drinking and later found himself at a colleague's apartment, he began fantasizing about a young, slender male sexual partner who would be unconscious, completely passive, or deceased. Dennis started having his dark thoughts while he was in the service, away from the other cadets, in his room by himself. Frequently, these fantasies involved visions about dominating or being in charge in a relationship in which his partner might or might not survive the encounter. So now we see the beginning of the disorientation in his mind. However, later he moved to London for training as he decided to join the Metropolitan Police. London then became the starting point of the actual horror. Nilsen felt quite lonely after completing his police training in 1973, and he desperately longed to have a companionship as he had in the army. It wasn't long before he began drinking alone in the evenings and visited gay bars, being all vulnerable. These bars were his place of interaction, where he often had sexual links with other men. In a year or so, Dennis stopped working for the police and joined the job center as a civil servant. 3 years before his killing spree, in 1975, Nilsen started living with his partner David Gallican in a rented ground-floor apartment at 195 Melrose Avenue. Gallican soon bid him goodbye and departed from him after 2 years due to unresolved conflicts, leaving him all by himself. Nilsen stayed in misery until 1978, the year the killing started. Birth of a relentless killer. So now we all know that it was his misery and loneliness that led him to become what he was. The failed relationships were the cause of his beginning as a serial killer. When observing the streak of his killings, most of his victims were found to be gay or homeless men whom he met randomly on public transportation or in bars. Although Nilsen admitted to the fact that the killings had a sexual component as he was aroused by his victims, but he never penetrated any of them. Just like Dahmer, Nilsen had the urge to keep his victims close to him as he wanted company. But then why did he kill them? Well, Dahmer and Nilsen both killed their first victims for identical reasons. It was simple. They didn't want their companions to leave them alone. Stephen Holmes, a 14-year-old he met in a bar and lured back to his house for drinks and music, became Nilsen's first victim. Strangely, and perhaps as a result of his failed relationships, he believed he could relate to people better if they were incapable to escape or reply to him. To achieve this, he killed one person before bathing, dressing, and spending time with the body while conversing and watching television. Well, that sounds creepy. Eventually, Nilsen was stopped by a plumbing problem. In response to complaints from both Nilsen and other tenants, a plumber removed a drain cover and found several tiny bones and a substance that resembled flesh. The plumber voiced his worries to his supervisor, and both of them filed a report. They were identified as human after an examination and analysis of the remains. When police arrived at Nilsen's home, they found other remains, notably plastic bags containing human heads and dismembered body parts in a cupboard. Nilsen finally confessed to murdering after roughly 16 different interviews and more than 30 hours of interrogation, but he was certain that it was not planned and that the decision to kill was taken only before the deed itself. Nilsen was finally charged with murder on February 11, 1983, and sent to prison to await his trial. Nilsen was given a life sentence after being found guilty of 6 charges of murder and 1 count of attempted murder by November of that same year. Nilsen was admitted to a hospital on May 10th after complaining of excruciating abdominal pain. He underwent aortic aneurysm surgery, but after experiencing difficulties, he passed away 2 days later. His immediate causes of death were determined by an autopsy to be a pulmonary embolism and retroperitoneal hemorrhage. In June 2018, he was cremated and his ashes were handed to his family. Although this was an end to the horrors of Dennis Nilsen, the world never forgot his terrifying story. It still sends goosebumps to all of us listening to how mercilessly he killed all his victims. Dahmer and Nilsen butchered men and boys because they desired total control over the individuals they considered beautiful. not because they were sexual sadists or took particular enjoyment in the murder itself. Nilsen himself accepted that he had a fear of emotional rejection and failure, as he was bullied at school and only had one long-term relationship in his life. He was also a heavy drinker, and all of these factors, when combined, gave birth to a horrendous serial killer. So, this was the story of the British Dahmer, Dennis Nilsen. Thanks for watching, and please click on the subscribe button if you liked this video, and turn on the notification so you don't miss out on our next video.